Hello and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm your host, Greg Lindsay, Director of Applied Research here at NewCities, and welcome to the inaugural edition of Higher Ground. This is our first event to really explicitly address the effects of climate change, which has traditionally been a thread running through all of our events and work devoted to well-being, mobility, housing, and more. And in NewCities fashion, our role today is not to pose as the experts, because you, our partners, our speakers, our participants, are the real experts when it comes to climate adaptation, migration, and the word that dare not speak its name, retreat. Our aim for the next 3 days is to bring together what we hope is the broadest conversation to date on how, when, where, and why to save people over places when it comes to the encroaching risks of climate change. We have a fantastic lineup of discussions and workshops in store for you over the next 3 days. Now, this event would not have been possible without our partners, NewCities members Jacobs, the McKinsey Global Institute, our host Orlando, more on which in a moment, our in-kind partners at the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, Climigration, the University of Central Florida's Urban Resilience Initiative, and our workshop host from Bruges, Buy-in, and the National League of Cities. I would encourage you all to join our Slack community. In addition to having conversations here in the interface of the conference itself, we've launched Higher Ground, a climate migration community on Slack where you can join, continue the conversation, network amongst yourselves, and hopefully have a bit of a richer experience that will persist long after we finished here today. I would also encourage you, of course, to tweet and post to social media as you see fit with the hashtag Higher Ground. Now, before we begin the program, I'd like to begin, of course, with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today here in Montreal from unceded Indigenous lands, and that the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the land and waters in which I join this virtual gathering today. As urbanists, we believe it's important to learn about this history, how we are connected to our land, and of course, this issue is more important than ever when it comes to issues of climate migration. Now, with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer. Now, why did we choose to partner with Orlando for our inaugural edition? Because his administration in Orlando is one of the few in North America to not only acknowledge the necessity of climate migration and rethinking how and where we will live in this century, but has already begun planning for it. So please welcome Mayor Buddy Dyer.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, NewCities team, for the opportunity to co-host this inaugural event with you and explore how cities can better prepare for climate change mitigation, migration. And that is certainly a topic that is relevant for us here in Orlando. It's probably not news to you that Florida's ground zero for many of the climate change impacts that the world is witnessing, whether it's sea level change, sea level rise, which you can certainly see down in Miami, or saltwater intrusion into our drinking water, to extreme heat and more intense hurricanes. So Orlando is the one big city that's inland, so we're subject to being an inbound city for those families that are most affected by climate impacts in the Caribbean or the coastal communities of Florida. And this really became a reality back in the 2017 hurricane season. Specifically, we had Irma and Maria, and our city welcomed more than 300,000 people that were seeking refuge from Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and our own Florida coastlines. And one of the things we did quickly was activate our City of Orlando Hispanic Office of Local Assistance. And that's an office that connects newly arrived residents with services. So we were able to provide service to those families who are landing here in Orlando and didn't have anywhere to go. And this became a very significant resource to those families. And I'm happy to see that our OLA offices, Anna Cruz, will be joining Chris Castro later on a panel that'll share more about that story. These hurricanes were really a significant wake-up call and dress rehearsal for future waves of climate migrants, and it reinforced the importance of what we call our GreenWorks Orlando initiative and the work we've been doing to advance sustainability and resilience. In Orlando, we've been out front on the issue of climate change for the last 10 years, even as our state, certainly our state and federal governments, were silent or even moving backwards on the matter. So since 2015, we've made sure that Orlando has not been silent on the matter. And in fact, we signed the Paris Climate Agreement shortly after it was ratified, and then joined the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. Currently, I serve on the steering committee of the U.S. Climate Mayors Network, which is made up of 450 cities representing more than 100 million Americans who are upholding our commitments and further committing that we are still in it for climate action. So In addition to these pledges, the city has led by example. We've invested more than $20 million into retrofitting our buildings. We've installed solar arrays on city facilities like fire stations, parking lots. We even have floating solar arrays in our retention ponds and in our airport. We've worked with our electric utility to begin transition to 100% clean energy and net zero carbon. We've converted city fleet vehicles and public transit buses over to zero emission electric, and we've tackled food waste in restaurants and household and much more action to mitigate and adapt to the changing climate. Through the American Cities Climate Challenge, we have plans to bring forward over a dozen climate strategies over the next year, including a new green building incentive program, an EV ready code, and a new public EV charging stations all over our city. To assist our surrounding Central Florida communities, we will continue to engage our regional governments through the Regional Resilience Collaborative in order to make sure Orlando and Central Florida are more climate resilient. And I believe that our region's culture of collaboration and partnerships has been our strongest trait, whether it's partnering with our utility OUC, our transit authority links. We're working together to meet our climate and sustainability commitments and ensure Orlando continues to be a future-ready city. Thank you again for having the opportunity to share a little bit about our story here in Orlando, and I look forward to learning more about how other cities are preparing for climate migration.
Thank you so much, Mayor Dyer. Really appreciate having you as our virtual host this year. And thematically, we're going to have some great sessions this afternoon, as you mentioned, exploring particularly the issues that Orlando and Central Florida faces.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'm now proud to present our opening keynote speaker, Kim Stanley Robinson, whom the New Yorker has described as one of the greatest living science fiction writers. In his new book, The Ministry for the Future, he vividly describes a wet bulb heat wave that kills more than 20 million people in the Indian subcontinent. The resulting outcry leads the United Nations to create the Tytler Ministry, which engages in whatever it takes to forestall the worst of climate change, including planning, politics, and economics, many of the issues that we will cover over the next 3 days. And on that note, it's my pleasure to present Kim Stanley Robinson.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you everybody at Higher Ground. I'm glad you're meeting for this conference and discussing these issues in advance because they are certain to become more and more pressing as we get into the 21st century. And as a science fiction writer, I've been writing about climate change consistently now for about 20 years, and it seems to me that this particular conference and the title Higher Ground puts the focus on sea level rise in a way that was rare in the past and becoming more common. And I'm going to talk in my opening remarks about that just as a setting what you might call the long-term scenarios that might be possible. It's also worth noting that there's been a philosophical argument going on in the environmental humanities and the everybody who's trying to deal with this coming problem of climate change. Do we focus on mitigation? Do we focus on adaptation? As if this were an either or. And I would say that this conference is focused on what used to get called adaptation, but we're at a kind of all hands on deck moment where distinctions like that are not important anymore, and planning is, no matter what happens. So although I've always insisted on a focus on mitigation of climate change in the first place, that's all very well, but now that we're in the moment that we're in and we're coming into the decades that we are, adaptations are going to be necessary. So sea level rise is a strange one. You'll notice that the IPCC is much more cautious in their predictions of what might happen because it's really difficult to determine in advance. And so it's a delayed after temperature rise by some unestimable number of years, and it goes up higher or lower in ways that are also very hard to calculate in advance, except to set parameters. And then also once it begins, which it already has in a small way, there's a certain unstoppability to it. In other words, no matter what we do, there's going to be some sea level rise, and that includes even the best possible responses that you can imagine. So a couple of years ago, when an important paper was published by the famous NASA scientist and climate activist James Hansen and 18 co-authors published a paper suggesting that about 125,000 years in the past, with a similar rapid increase in global average temperature to what we've just seen over the last century, that sea level quickly rose in the following century by between 10 and 15 meters. Now, this was shocking and far higher of a sea level rise than anything that IPCC has suggested. And it turns out that Hansen's co-authors included scientists from almost a dozen different fields, assembling an argument about the Paleo sea level that was complicated and articulated in such a way that it was almost as much a work of art or interpretation as a scientific paper. For me, it was useful because I was writing a book in which I wanted Lower Manhattan underwater almost all the time. For the planning community, it was kind of a shocker and a stimulus to thought, but no one has completely refuted the paper either. So clearly the situation is volatile and has to do with the big glaciers in Antarctica and in Greenland. Mostly Antarctica, but Greenland's an important player, particularly since Greenland's warming up even faster than Antarctica is. And I'm probably everybody at this conference is already aware of this fact that if all of the ice on the planet were to melt, that sea level would be about 270 feet higher. So that means most of Florida, except for that little ridge down the middle of the state, and even that would be very low ground. That's not going to happen anytime soon and maybe ever, because Antarctica is 80 to 90% of that and is a kind of a freeze box of its own, being right down there on the South Pole and surroundings. But the thing is that the glaciers that are at the periphery of the Antarctic continent are sliding faster into the sea than they have been by a factor of about 10. And I'll come back to that because it's that slide into the sea and subsequent melting that is going to cause whatever sea level rise we get. That will be the biggest factor compared to the others, such as expansion of the ocean by rising temperature, etc. So what you all are going to be meeting to talk about is very interesting. In a way, these coastal cities, you know better than I, these are massive infrastructures that have taken centuries to build. You can't move those cities outright, but it's necessary, maybe it will become necessary anyway, to move their populations. So there's an urge towards resilience and robustness, but especially coastal cities right at sea level are in an impossible situation to adapt. And that's why you get this forbidden word that Greg brought up in his first introduction, retreat, which we do need to talk about. So there will be a desire to stay in place. People everywhere want to stay in their homes, but people on coastlines are maybe even more than usually attached to their place as such. I grew up on beaches myself, and I know this feeling very well. There's going to be a desire to stay in place at home, and there's going to be the impossibility of doing that by simply the drowning of the infrastructure that people need to stay alive. There might be an attempt to do some kind of intertidal living, of an adaptation to an intertidal life. I wrote about this in my New York 2140, but I believe that that would be subsequent to the initial evacuations that would be necessary. In other words, the adaptation would happen after the sea level rise and not beforehand. So creating resilience at the coast, this will be your topic over the next 3 days, and I will be looking forward to hearing what people have to say because of the difficulties involved. But I've heard this process called managed retreat, and I think it would be something to discuss. If this conference were in person, I would recommend this to be one of the main informal discussion topics to get ahead of the language game. That managed retreat is a word like a name like geoengineering that is subject to misinterpretation in a negative light. Retreat is basically a military metaphor, implying that we're losing a war, and that many retreats turn into routes. And in general, that is probably a problematic word to begin with, but then managed implies managers, implies top down, implies people very much like you all who are meeting to discuss this in advance in a planning way, somehow taking control over the people who actually live on the ground and whose lives are going to be affected. Well, we do need plans, we do need experts, we do need help in emergency situations. But this is one of those weird topics where the emergency is real, but stretched out over a decade or two. And so the word emergency is also not quite appropriate. So we talk maybe about relocation. Well, that has a very bad connotations historically, relocation of Native American populations, etc. The word, I think, has not yet been found. And I myself, in this last week, thinking about my talk to you, don't have a good replacement phrase to suggest, although I read in EOS, which is the magazine of the American Geophysical Union, and a very good magazine, an article by a couple of young postdocs who talked about community choice being in the title of whatever you decide. In other words, that one goes out into the world and says, well, look, this is a matter of community choice survival, or community choice hanging together, community choice coherence, another CCC, something out of the social sciences, so that you avoid any concepts of management and of engineering. I bring up the comparison to geoengineering, which is raise the hackles of anybody listening to think that we could actually engineer the Earth's basic systems when we don't know enough and we don't have enough power. Again, that sounded top-down, managerial, and elitist in a way that caused resistance to the ideas of geoengineering, even if they were the most benign and positive and harm-free processes in the world. Nevertheless, if they get tagged by the term geoengineering, they are automatically condemned in advance as being intrusive and unfortunate in their implications. So I would say, to the extent that you can have general discussions on Zoom and in the workshops that you might be gathering there for this weekend, this week, to discuss what you're going to call the adaptation that you are trying to design now. So the project is so giant and so spanning time and space and different conditions and situations, and moving people outright and talking about infrastructure and governance, that you get into one of these hyper object moments where the topic is too big to be discussed adequately in any one discipline. And I'm sure you'll be talking about that as the conference goes on. But it also brings up this: it's going to be expensive. And all the planning in the world is going to be useless if the good projects don't get paid for. So I want to, since Greg mentioned my latest novel, The Ministry for the Future, which grapples with these very issues, a little bit less on the coastlines than in my New York novel. But nevertheless, the issue is how these things are not profitable. These projects don't make a profit. And therefore, capital, as it exists in our world today, will not invest in them, because capital goes, like water going downhill or sea level rising, capital goes to the highest rate of return. And that's a law of capital. It is the people who are directing capital of fiduciary responsibilities and even sometimes legal requirements to go for the highest rate of return. So there won't be payment. So how? Well, it's got to be quantitative easing. We just heard today that Congress may pass a bill that is another almost $1 trillion introduced into the economy. This is in effect new money. And ever since the 2008 quantitative easing to get out of the real estate crisis, and then also the start of this year, the pandemic, $2 trillion, something close to $10 trillion has been introduced into our economy from scratch without destroying people's faith in money and without creating inflation or deflation. Quantitative easing is now more and more recognized, and there are even new fields in economics like modern monetary theory that are attempting to conceptualize what that means, that the making up of new money by governments is not destabilizing and could be a force for good. So now there's carbon quantitative easing. And this is really what the European Union is doing with its green recovery from the pandemic. And the Green New Deal, House Resolution 109 in the United States does not call out the necessity to pay for it and doesn't describe how it would be done. But it's clear from the European model and from the other examples of quantitative easing that we are indeed going to have the central banks of the world create new money that is targeted in advance for its first payout to be towards carbon drawdown and decarbonization projects and the kind of relocations or managed retreats, or let's find that better word, the community-led reconstruction of communities on higher ground. The CCCs are going to have to be paid for by the central banks creating that money and by legislative action. So since the New Deal comes up, one has to say that the New Deal that we use this word for from the 1930s, that was not just a single moment, but was a description of about 13 to 15 years of projects. So it's the name for a period, not just the name for one single piece of legislation. There were 5 big movements to the New Deal of the 30s and 40s, culminating with FDR's great GI Bill. And that's the kind of process that we are beginning now, where there will be funding, and then the plans that you all are discussing now will get funding out of necessity by government action. So to end, I want to make a plea for mitigation that that we never stop trying to decarbonize really quickly in our efforts to mitigate the damage of climate change and get to a carbon negative civilization such that we begin to draw carbon CO2 out of the atmosphere that we burned up into it and get back down to 350 parts per million, at which point sea level rise might not be as extreme a disaster as it's going to be if we don't do that. So I just want to say direct air capture, that these new cities that you are going to be designing that are on higher ground should always be carbon negative, that they should always include direct air capture that is grabbing CO2 out of the atmosphere and turning it to good uses or just burying it, as the case may be. And I even in my Ministry for the Future discuss a plan that was given to me by glaciologists in Antarctica to drain the water from underneath these glaciers in Antarctica and Greenland to slow them back down to their original speed, at which point sea level rise becomes a much less present a danger. So this is geoengineering, this is central bank action, this is decarbonization by direct air capture is still a prototype type technology, but it's right on the cusp of becoming real, and then it needs to get paid for and done. And I'll end by saying, as a lover of beaches when I was a kid, the beaches of the world are doomed without this mitigation, and even your great work won't save them, but only put people further away from them. Save the sand. The sand isn't that much. Let's be trucking and siphoning and moving the sand uphill with the people so that the beach cultures of the world can live on. This is partly a joke and partly a serious proposal to keep one of the great biomes on this planet alive for the health of us all as a part of a healthy biosphere. Beaches matter. So We can't just abandon them. We might be involved with designing and rebuilding them and moving them. And that's a rather awesome thought that I will conclude with. Save our beaches. And thank you, Greg.
Thank you so much, Stan. A fantastic talk, and you touched upon so many of the themes that we'll be discussing over the next 3 days, ranging from, of course, managed retreat and how to rethink that, how to rebrand it, as you said. There are several groups participating that are actually working on that question as we speak. How we will pay for it, questions of carbon quantitative easing, as you mentioned, about how we will build these new cities of tomorrow and how we should build them. We have a session on design, of course. And creating a sort of taxonomy of climate sending and receiving cities. We're gonna have a workshop on about thinking, how do we define the cities of the future and move them? And as you elegantly raised at the end, not just the people we're moving, but the landscapes we're leaving behind and what should be done with those. How will we save our beaches? How can we return some of this land to nature or approximate thereof? So thank you so much, Dan. It's been an incredible pleasure and an honor, and thank you for framing the stakes for us. It's been a fantastic start.
Good luck to you all.
Thank you. For the rest of you, I would encourage you all log into our next session, which will be beginning momentarily, climbing to higher ground, sort of helping set the stage for the broader discussion over the next few days. I'll see you over there momentarily.